Hello. Hi, everyone. I see there's a chatty group in the front there. I know there's riveting conversation happening, so I just wanted to let everyone know that we'll be starting our next session soon. So if you can kindly find your seats, there are lots of space in the front, so please feel free to come sit closer to the front. Awesome. So as we wait for more people to trickle in, welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you all here today, especially for the very first Science Up First in-person and online event. So my name is Krishana Sankar. I am Science Up First's in-house science advisor and community partnerships lead. And today, I am honored to moderate a panel on the science of misinformation. So we know that health misinformation is a serious threat to society. In an increasing online and networked world, accessing accurate information can be challenging. This panel examines the viral spread of misinformation, false claims, and conspiracy theories through a variety of social media and online sources, and highlight strategies to consider when trying to access credible health information. So today I'm joined by 4 phenomenal researchers, as you see, sitting here on the stage with me today, and they will be sharing their insights on the topic. Each speaker will present their talk for 15 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussion. We welcome everyone to join in the conversation, both online and in person, by asking your questions to the panelists after they've finished all their presentations. And now, without further ado, let's start today's panel with our first speaker. So our first speaker is Alessandro Marcon. He's a research associate at the Health Law Institute. He'll be talking about making sense of complex misinformation dynamics, case studies, and speculative inquiries. Alessandro. Let's get a round of applause for him to come to the stage, guys. Come on.
Yeah, hello. So my name's Sandro, and I'm a research associate, as she said, at the HLI, the Health Law Institute. The Health Law Institute has been doing media work on the portrayal of science information for about 2 decades, and I'm contributing to that work that goes on there. Looking at some misinformation. What I thought I'd do is highlight a couple studies that we've done and just kind of expand and reflect and kind of provide some additional thoughts, seeing as this work is already published work. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is one that we published in 2017 called Fake News Portrayals of Stem Cells and Stem Cell Research. To conduct this study, what we did is we used a platform called Open Sources, which is a database of websites that were flagged with one of these denominators, so fake news, satire, extreme bias, conspiracy theory, etc. And we highlighted just 2 of these, fake news and junk science, and we searched for stem cells inside of all of these different websites to build a data set of articles. And what we basically saw is, no surprise, hyperbolic, exaggerated fears around benefits, fears and benefits around the stem cell therapies, a whole bunch of junk stem cell science, as well as science generally, fostering fears of this idea of a cancer industry, as well as some mention of Obama's baby murdering and blood harvesting cult, which I didn't know about before until reading these websites. And one of the major websites that existed in this was a website called Natural News, which is quite well known in these circles now, but to us it was very new, the presence of this website. So some of the additional things that we saw on this website is we saw a huge network and orchestration going on between the websites. So some of the web domains were basically repackaging the same story using different words, publishing different articles that were basically saying the same thing, and hyperlinking to other websites who would hyperlink back to those sites. And what we kind of concluded on the fringe of the studies, it's basically a huge clickbait machine to generate attention for some of these websites. Another piece of information research that we saw was from an NPR investigative report, which looked at a fake news creator who existed in the suburbs. And they tracked this person down and they talked to him. And what he wasn't actually trying to spread misinformation for a political agenda. What he was trying to do is just play the trickster role and generate some controversy or do an experiment, basically. And what he saw is that when he created fake news, he could create a huge audience. He was just shocked that he would have millions of people come to a little fringe website that he set up. and that this content was in turn very lucrative. So he was saying that people would generate between $10,000 and $30,000 a month just from creating these small websites, which is a huge amount of revenue, which again for us at this time in 2017 was quite new. And lastly, what kind of emerged from this study in the back end of the study, I guess, is again coming back to Natural News. Once Natural News discovered that they had been labeled as a fake news website, they absolutely attacked the person who had created the open sources database. So I'm sure people here are familiar with the idea of doxing. So they doxed this professor. They actually had an explicit mention on their websites that their readers should go and attack her online, as well as at her email and her office. And because of this, of course, the professor had to step away from this website and basically had to remove it from getting harassed and getting doxxed. I think this is an underreported, kind of under-acknowledged aspect of fighting misinformation. We talk a lot about people needing to do it and to get out there and do it. Maybe we don't talk enough about some of the repercussions that can come from that. Mariana Spring from the BBC talks a lot about this and some of the difficulties she's faced trying to fight misinformation. So what do we see in this orchestration of misinformation, what we typically call now disinformation? We see these substantive collaborative networks. We could almost call them communities now that exist. They're this generation of financial and social capital. There's money to be made, there's status to be gained. Some really nice investigative reporting has shown that perhaps only 12 people are responsible for a huge swath of the misinformation that exists around vaccines. And the network basically exists to just continually support these people. The major funder of anti-vaccine movement, Joseph Mercola, he's also made millions selling natural health products, so there's tons of finances to be made, as well as becoming famous inside of these circles. They're highly emotional spaces, so we know that emotion generates viral content, that people that rely on emotions when they're reading the news are more likely to fall for fake news. And also there's an emotional element of creating content that get likes. So we feel good when we get likes and we become more prominent inside the community, and there's an emotional aspect inside of that. The Liver King story is a great example to look at for this idea of becoming famous online. And lastly, the algorithms that run social media reinforce these networks. They ensure viralness, they play off cognitive biases, repeat exposures, they maintain our attention, and it basically makes it really difficult to find truth. What does one of the results, especially when we start getting polemic topics, is the idea, of course, of polarization, divided groups that basically cannot talk to one another. This leads us to the second study that we published in 2021 called the Hydroxychloroquine Twitter War. This was a case study examining polarization in science communication. Just a little background on hydroxychloroquine in case people don't know. In March 2020, non-peer-reviewed research was published showing that hydroxychloroquine could work effectively against COVID-19. Around the same time, a little bit afterwards, March, coming into April, the study was shown to have severe methodological flaws, but it was hyped a lot, it was promoted, it was cited a lot, off-label prescriptions increased. Trump was promoting hydroxychloroquine. By mid-April, there was some media analysis showing that Fox News had promoted hydroxychloroquine as a potential treatment considerably more than other major news websites, news sources, excuse me. And finally, in late April, around April 21st, we had initial clinical research showing that hydroxychloroquine basically didn't work that well. It was severe critique around whether or not it was going to be effective. And also some health recommendations came out recommending against its use. So we were very lucky because we started noticing some of these trends emerging, and we started to build a data set capturing tweets in real time with hydroxychloroquine. That might not sound like a big deal, but capturing tweets in real time is very important methodologically to capture everything and not just what relies on Twitter's API for relevancy. So you can capture stuff that gets deleted later on or accounts that get banned from the site, which doesn't happen as much anymore with Elon Musk at the helm. So what we're asking here is, so how was Twitter portraying hydroxychloroquine in a week when research began casting doubts on its effectiveness? A science-based Twitter, we could say, in sum, would be critiquing rather than promoting hydroxychloroquine. So basically, if the sum of people were following the science, they would say, well, it's indicating that it's not really working. So we built this data set, had about 1 million tweets. 77% of these were retweets. So again, this idea that you've got particular nodes or particular people that are really being amplified by the networks that exist underneath them. We used a 95% confidence interval to build 4 different data sets: the most retweeted tweets, or a sample of random tweets, most retweeted users, and then a random sample of users as well. And we basically built 2 different coding frames to understand what was going on in each, the tweets as well as the users. We also wanted to take a deeper dive at the kinds of users that were creating this content, and one of these was bots. I'm not sure if people are familiar with bots, but these are robotic accounts that exist online that can do any kind of task that you ask them to do. Most notably, they can retweet certain accounts. They generate a lot of trends online, amplify certain messages, etc. They can also troll. And so we use the Botometer program, which is from the University of Indiana. It's kind of one of the best ones that's out there to do this. And we used a threshold of 4 on the Botometer score is what we would use to classify as bots for this study. Coincidentally, Elon Musk used this Botometer program when he ran his test to see how many bots would exist on Twitter. And there's like significant methodological problems with doing that. We also looked at users who had an affiliation with QAnon. So if they were using the QAnon hashtag or they were including images of General Michael Flynn or linking to Parler accounts, we kind of wanted to see how many users were QAnon-esque. Just go back to the Botometer account just to see how it works. I ran myself through the Botometer to see how body I was, and I got a score of 0, which was nice to see, I guess. Tim has a Botometer score of 1.6, and so you might ask, well, how does he have a bit of a score? Well, because many more bots interact with Tim, which helps raise the score. He also gets a lot more hate mail, etc. And if we take an example of a bona fide bot, for example, something called Relative Bot, which makes silly comparisons between things such as 461 avocados fit inside a millennial, and we run this through Botometer, what we see is that it gets a score of 4.2. So is it perfect? No, but it helps us kind of situate bodiness and what's body. Most retweeted tweets, perhaps an unsurprise. So this is one, this is disgusting. Democrats in Detroit are going to censor Democratic State Representative Karen Winsett for her support of hydroxychloroquine. She spoke out about the drug saving her life after suffering COVID. Are you kidding me? Retweet. And on the other side, we have Dan Rather, are bleach and sunlight the new hydroxychloroquine? So what do we see? General findings, huge amounts of polarization, lots of bickering, lots of in-group signaling, and lots of reactionary discourse. And what I mean by this is very seldom were tweets simply promoting or critiquing hydroxychloroquine. About half of the most retweeted tweets were doing just that. More often what tweets were doing, in one case for the promotion side 77% versus the critiquing side 84%, is they were signaling the arguments that the other side of the camp were making or intertwining the other side of the arguments. And a very good example of this in the critiquing is the people who were saying that hydroxychloroquine might not work could not stop talking about Donald Trump. So about 75% of the most retweeted tweets mentioned Trump, and 94% of these were critiquing Donald Trump. So they basically were not just talking about the science. On the other side, for the side that was promoting hydroxychloroquine in the face of the science that was emerging, about 80% of all the bot accounts were promoting it. So you have a huge, relatively large bot army that's out there promoting hydroxychloroquine, and about 76% of the QAnon-linked accounts were also promoting hydroxychloroquine. So this idea of bots is really problematic. Is everyone familiar with this logo you might have seen? This is Chat GPT. This is AI software which is growing in prominence and it's becoming extremely powerful. This is really going to exacerbate these networks and how we understand these networks. Chat GPT can now pass the exams for the MBA programs and get medical licenses. It's creating text that's indecipherable. Just this week, BuzzFeed announced it's going to be using Chat GPT to write content for its website. So if we go back, you can start to imagine when you talk about these fake news websites not needing to hire actual writers, they can just use AI to create the content. It's going to be a lot to deal with, and I think it's very under-researched, this idea of bots and AI and how they're contributing to these networks. Lastly, in the studies, we conclude at such an early stage in the pandemic, discussion around whether a bot like hydroxychloroquine could help COVID-19 thus became highly polarized and infused with political and ideological positions. Very few of the discussions were solely focused on discussing scientific developments and clinical data, even among those critiquing hydroxychloroquine. In short, Twitter became a battleground in which participants consistently wasted opportunities for clear and accurate scientific communication. Social media platforms need to be assertively combating misinformation, but members of the public, especially those with substantial media influence, should also consider the best ways to transmit accurate science, foster productive discussions, and educate the public without exacerbating political tensions. And that's a big point, I think, at the bottom. I think people notice that you can exacerbate political tensions and get a lot more attention for your tweet, but at what expense are you doing that? This brings up the idea of discourse coalitions, which is an idea from Martin Hayer, a really important idea to think about how discourse works, especially online. Basically, the idea of a discourse coalition is kind of language armies or language groups who use similar language, similar arguments, and even similar logic to make their case, and memes as well, of course, online. And what happens is we have to start asking ourselves whether or not these kinds of discourses are just reinforcing the group or they're actually working to educate the group that's on the other side. I also believe that the people are starting to recognize the teams that are forming, and they can immediately take a stance on the issue that the other side's promoting without actually engaging the information that they're providing. So I ask here, are these discursive acts striving to make inroads into the other group, or are the acts only serving to strengthening our own group and strengthen our own position inside of that group? Are we educating and inspiring thought, or are we actually trying to hope to change minds with some of our discursive acts? This, of course, is prevalent in the case of vaccines, and I can't think about vaccines without the amazing work of Katie Atwell, who's in Australia, who just has a phenomenal amount of amazing research that's very comprehensive and really trying to understand how people process the idea of vaccines. And this piece that I just constantly think about is called The Unhealthy Other, how vaccine-rejecting parents construct the vaccinating mainstream. And without reading all of this, I'll just cut to the bottom half of this. It says, it is common for the vaccinating mainstream to present vaccine-hesitant and rejecting parents as a group subject to epistemic closure, groupthink, confirmation bias, and overconfidence in their own expertise. However, vaccine-hesitant and rejecting parents also see mainstream society as a group, a much larger one subject to the same problems. So the ways that the standard body of, our collective body of scientists view people who are vaccine hesitant is the same way that lots of people that are vaccine hesitant view mainstream groups. So we can start to see these very thick divisions that almost exist on some of the same rationality, a way of justifying their position. To kind of engage these topics, this is just recently put out called a Toolbox of Interventions Against Online Misinformation and Manipulation, as well as it's basically a huge summary of the evidence of what is showing to work or not work. And they have an online toolbox that you can go and everyone can check out. They mention on the one side the intervention, they give a description of it. So for example, accuracy prompts. They talk about this conceptual framework, how it works, what's the evidence substantiating whether or not it works, in what context does it work. Just a beautiful tool that I will be checking out for myself for sure and diving deeper into. I also like the idea that they're trying to continually evaluate the evidence for each one of these different kind of interventions and update it and see, ongoing evidence, what works and what doesn't. I think this is really important for reaching the people that are in the middle ground. There's a lot of arguments to be made that the people that are already highly polarized, there's not much you can do, especially online. But there's definitely people in the middle ground who sit in those spaces. They haven't been convinced one way or another yet. And so we can really maybe work on those kinds of individuals and help stop polarization before it becomes really thick. So lastly, on the case of vaccines, again, this idea of working on vaccine hesitancy. One of the core things that we really have to do is understand other people's positions. We have to take the time to listen to people and understand how these positions are formed and why they hold them the way that they do. I think there's a lot of work that was done that was very positive during COVID. One of the revelations, for example, was that people fear needles, and fearing needles just might mean that you just don't want to go and get a shot. Even if you think you're pro-vaccine and you want to get it, they just think, it's an intervention I'd rather avoid. From some of the research I saw, people used to think this was just for kids, but they're noticing a lot of people don't like getting a shot. So in this strain of listening, trying to understand these perspectives, of course, the wonderful initiative that brings us here together, Science Up First, we are currently doing an analysis of all the negativity that existed in Science Up First's first year of operation. So from January 1st to the end of the year, we've collected 22,000 posts, which exist from contributors, as well as people who engage in comments. And what we're trying to do is just make sense specifically of the negativity. So how is the negativity expressed, and what can we learn from that negativity so that we can reinforce the work that Science Up First is doing, maybe improve it, and continue working in this regard. So thank you very much, and thanks a lot to our team at the University of Alberta, and thank you so much for having me.
Just me adjusting the mic because I'm a little bit short. Anyway, thanks so much, Sandro, for that amazing talk. I know that, so we originally said we would keep questions to the end, but there are several questions that actually came up for me during your talk. And I did want to ask you at least one or two of them before we moved on to our next presenter. So you did mention about ChatGPT, I think it's called. Yes, I also heard about that, I think, last year at the UN Biodiversity Conference. So I'm wondering, do you think there's a way that we could sort of hack it or use ChatGPT to help to fight misinformation?
I think that's beyond my expertise in terms of how we can use that specific tool. But that is anytime a tool exists, it can be used in a multifarious, many different ways. And so I think, yes, there's the chance. I'm sure we'll see some of these kind of discursive wars that I was mentioning here. I think they'll be exacerbated on both sides by a technology like that.
True, thank you for that. And just one more. What type of strategies do you think we could use to help dissolve that polarization, especially that we're seeing between the vaccine hesitant parent population versus those who are not? Because I know that particular population, that particular population is really concerned. Obviously, we don't want to minimize their concerns, but being able to reduce or dissolve that polarization, I think, is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've been thinking about is whether or not there is still a space when the polarization is that thick for online discourse. I think that it seems like a lot of the online discourse is just exacerbating some of the tensions, and I think some new techniques, specifically moving offline and trying to involve more communities in real spaces where people are already embedded inside of a community with people that they trust, perhaps is a better way of creating some inroads. And there's been lots of talk about this, about understanding what figures are influential in different communities and being able to have those figures talk to some people that are inside of their communities, as opposed to the answer always being, well, the problem is online and we need to be online to solve the problem. I think there's some steps back that are needed and some new approaches needed.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know we're excited to see what your research is going to show about the Science Up First content as well. All right, moving on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Marco Zanon. He's a research associate at the Health Law Institute, and he'll be speaking on exploiting unmet medical needs, alternative cancer clinical social media advertising, and Google reviews. Marco, welcome to the stage.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for having me and for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today to present my talk, Exploiting Unmet Medical Needs, Alternative Cancer Clinic Social Media Advertising, and Google Reviews. How did you click it? So to start my presentation, I want to tell a story. I want to introduce you to Hannah. So Hannah isn't a real person, but Hannah's story is drawn from elements of our research that we've seen. So Hannah's 34 years old. She has stage 4 breast cancer, and unfortunately, she's recently been told that she doesn't have any more treatment options, and the only option left is hospice. She has 2 children, 2 and 4 years old, and she's a high school teacher. After her diagnosis, Hannah felt really lonely. She felt like she couldn't relate to people who were in her situation. So at the urging of her family and her healthcare providers, she went online to find support, and she ended up joining a couple of Facebook groups and different forums. And on these forums, she found that community she desired, and she started seeing stories of people in very similar situations to her, and she ended up sharing her story as well. And through this, she ended up making friends. And one of the friends that she made suggested that she check out this place called Chipsa Hospital. And so she went to the Facebook page of Chipsa Hospital. She sees, wow, a lot of people seem to engage with this content. 130,000 people like this page. And as she went through the page, she started seeing all of these testimonials of people who were in very similar situations to her that were helped by Chipsa Hospital, some even being cured or having their lives meaningfully prolonged. So Hannah Googles Chipsa because she wants to kind of understand what's going on with this clinic. So she sees from the Google listing that this is a cancer specialty clinic, that the reviews are generally high. There's 113, 4.2 stars. And as she looks at these reviews, as many of us do, she starts to see more of these testimonials of people really being helped by this clinic, people who are on their deathbed getting months or years more, and people being cured. So Hannah kind of thinks to herself, well, I don't have any other treatment options. This has worked for me. I'm going to do everything I can to be there for my family longer than right now. And the family couldn't afford this treatment, though. So they created GoFundMe. They raised about $15,000, and they used a lot of their own personal savings. Hannah goes to Mexico for a month. She receives a lot of different treatments, things like Coley's therapy. Chipsa tells Hannah this treatment went really well, and Hannah's really encouraged by this. She wants to come back for more. She's feeling really good. But unfortunately, when Hannah went back home and she checked in with her oncologist, there was no improvement, and Hannah died 2 months later. And this is the impact we see that cancer misinformation can have. We know it's highly prevalent. In some situations, cancer misinformation receives more engagement than factual sources. It can disrupt relationships between a healthcare provider and patient, but also within a family, it can cause tension. In really extreme scenarios, it can cause people to opt out of evidence-based care or conventional care in favor for alternative treatment. And why this is so concerning is that we know alternative cancer treatment on its own is associated with earlier mortality in patients with both curable or uncurable cancers. And in the worst scenarios, cancer misinformation can be used to provide false hope or to exploit people. And one of the in my view, leading ways this happens is from alternative cancer providers themselves. So they're known to market on groups like the one Hannah was on without putting themselves out there as actually that clinic who's advertising. And we see too many complaints from regulatory agencies to really keep up with how much this is happening. And we see this marketing happening on websites and in many other different places. But what we don't know, and what the talk that I'm going to be saying today, is if or how alternative cancer treatment providers are usually utilizing paid social media products. And why this is so different from like a website or something like that is targeted ads are uniquely effective at reaching specific groups with tailored messaging for very little cost. And to demonstrate what this looks like, I made my own fake alternative cancer clinic on Facebook. You can see my page on the left. And I made an ad within about 5 minutes of making this page. I didn't post the ad, of course, but you can see that my ad said I have a 99% cure rate, which is probably a bit more intense, probably than most of the ads you would actually see. And this ad, I targeted it to people that I think might resonate with the messaging I'm putting out there. So people who maybe engage with natural health products a bit more, or the known proponents or proponents of alternative health folks. And of course, my ad might have got flagged because Meta does have systems in place to detect these kind of bad ads. So ads that go against their community policies theoretically should be detected by their AI systems. So for example, some of those policies that they look out for is misinformation, unacceptable business practices, and misleading claims. But one of the concerns about this is there's a lot of questions about how well this works. And these are just a couple news stories showing how some of these bad ads filter through the system. And as recently as June 27, 2022, we could see that Facebook is alleged to bombard cancer patients with ads from proven treatments. And so that leads to me to the purpose of the study here, which I think suggests an immediate need to investigate the extent of paid alternative cancer treatments and their advertisements on social media. And we've partially filled this gap by analyzing the paid advertising activities of some of the most prominent alternative cancer care providers. How we did this is we retrieved a list of 86 alternative cancer providers. We looked at kind of like a public-facing website that shows the different options that are available to people looking for alternative cancer treatment. And we retrieved the ads from December 6th to December 12th, 2021. And then with the ads we collected, we performed a content analysis to see how they communicate the benefits of their services via these ads on Meta platforms. And through this process, we identified 310 paid ads from 11 alternative cancer clinics on Meta that week. And we found 7 distinct appeals that they made to prospective patients, which we'll dive into in a second. But very concerningly, we saw about 26% of these ads had direct statements signifying the offered cancer treatments are effective for curative or life-prolonging reasons. And remember, when we were talking earlier, alternative cancer treatment is almost always associated with earlier mortality if it's on its own. So some of the appeals that we saw and the strategies used in these ads, the one we saw the most often was imagery or text that the provider is qualified to advise and administer cancer treatment. So if you look at these ads, it looks like what you'd expect from a hospital or a medical clinic. You see language like clinic, you see the stethoscope, the physician coat, the settings look very clean, and they look like something that you would go to for medical care. But when we dive deeper, we kind of see that this isn't truly the case with a lot of these ads. So an example here is from Dr. Kevin Connors, who refers to himself as doctor, and also offers treatment and similarly uses those imagery of having a patient bed, things like that. But Dr. Kevin Connors actually practices under something called a pastoral medical license, which really has no business treating any kind of medical problem. And concerningly as well, Dr. Kevin Connors was a former chiropractor who no longer is a chiropractor because of some complaints. What we also saw was appeals to persons with limited options due to an advanced, aggressive, or terminal cancer prognosis. So in these ads, we saw the providers kind of situate themselves as, well, when you have no more options left, when you can't be cured anymore according to conventional care, this is where we come in and we can help you. And that was the primary appeal. And we see language used here, such as uncurable, stage 4, inoperable, in these ads. And they kind of come to provide that hope that there is still something that can be done. We saw a lot of testimonials from former clients who would comment on the care they received there or how the treatment affected their cancer. And unfortunately, what we saw with a lot of these testimonials is that there was a lot of people, similarly to that last slide, people who were in dire straits who were allegedly cured after having treatment at these clinics, often after only a short period of time. So if you look at the ad on the left, this person was allegedly cured after 11 weeks of treatment. And similar with the other two ads, again, uncurable forms of cancer cured. And these testimonials are very powerful. Imagine yourself in that situation where you're looking for the hope and you see a video such as the one on the far right, where it's someone crying and saying how they want to be there for their family. It can be very powerful, and that hope is restored. We saw a lot of ads referencing science or research. So a lot of these ads kind of, they would allude to science or a scientific process, but they would kind of put it out of context. And it gives this appearance that the treatments that they're offering are very advanced, they're scientific, based in science, cutting edge. And then the remaining strategies we saw were these ideas of holistic approaches, using caring language, and addressing the cancer cause versus the symptoms. So as an overview of these results, we can confirm that alternative cancer providers are using Meta products to advertise alternative cancer treatments to social media users. These treatments appear legitimate, and they target and exploit the hope of patients. We saw a lot of what we call science exploitation, where a promising medical idea is distorted, usually for profit. We didn't report it in this presentation, but all the treatments and approaches that were found in these ads, they're not effective for cancer. And now let's talk about the system that enables these ads. So Meta has this role in approving these ads, but they also profit from all of these ads. And we can see from these results that the tools directly enable alternative cancer clinics to promote and target their ads to persons with cancer. Even if maybe not directly, they still have these avenues to do that. And in difference to other studies, we demonstrate this active element in social media platforms spreading, but most importantly, profiting from medical misinformation or misleading information. And this isn't the first time this has happened. This has happened multiple times for more than just cancer. And when this happens, Meta kind of frames these ads as they're against the policies, they remove the ads, and they kind of say, this is what our processes are to identify and remove these ads. But you can see in a lot of these responses over the years that there's no actual structural change when this happens, and I would argue most of it's public relations oriented. So I would suggest our results suggest this case-by-case ad removal strategy after it's kind of reported in the media, and this kind of over-reliance on AI, which has its place, by Meta has not addressed and will not be able to address this problem. Our advice for Meta is that they already require this authorization process for certain kinds of ads, so for things like prescription drugs, for example. And I propose that they expand this to all medical advertisements. The approval process shouldn't rely solely on AI. AI is a very useful tool, but things fall through the cracks. And you have to kind of have that nuance considered. I also call for regular audits and strong disincentives, such as reporting to regulatory agencies and taking away advertising permissions. In giving this recommendation, though, I really want to point out the power dynamics at play here. The recommendation I just gave is framed and scaled in a way to what public health has control to intervene on, and is also likely to be positively received by Meta. Public health has little power in this space, so we kind of have to appeal to this good nature of platforms and kind of ask them to do these things. And the reason we do that is because these proposals aren't going to be pursued if they adversely impact social media platform business interests or their business models. And why this is so concerning is that we know in almost every other context, appealing to or working for a for-profit industry to improve health in a way that's against their financial interests is not effective, and it can even hurt public interests, even when case-by-case gains are achieved. And this context is emblematic of a larger power dynamic and how social media businesses reinforce their political power, acting as both infrastructure, advertiser, and thus both judge and interested party. And I would argue to actually act upon this issue of misleading advertisements requires examining and confronting this conflict of interest between social media business interests and public health. And although we use the example of cancer ads here, this is only one symptom of a larger business model at play that's in pursuit of profit, but at odds with public health objectives. And we know that social media business models are reliant on ads. And a lot of these key components that we see that have come to define the social media kind of business model is ad targeting, data harvesting, kind of maximizing the amount of actors who can use ads. That means allowing things like misinformation, promoting health-harming products, things like that. Also dark advertising, which is when the only people who know this ad is kind of being used is the actual advertiser themselves and the person who sees the ads, and there's no way for researchers to actually track this. And there's also limited enforcement on advertisers because they want to retain those advertisers. And I argue that this system is harmful before harm actually occurs. And what I think that we keep doing is that we accept this system as a status quo, and we continuously seek ways to improve it, but we never really recognize or acknowledge that this business model itself is harmful even before harm occurs, and we need to re-problematize it. And one thing that I want to point out as well, even though I've presented on ads today, is that ads are only one part of this problem of legitimacy and how these alternative cancer clinics become legitimate medical actors to a lot of folks. So it's one of our in-progress studies. We looked at Google reviews from alternative cancer clinics, and we collected about 1,100. We found that they were highly rated, 4.43 average stars usually. And we know that these Google reviews are used at time in decision-making, just like we saw with Hannah. But unfortunately, these reviews are very easy to manipulate. And we saw a lot of these alternative clinics don't actually list themselves as an alternative clinic. Again, like with Hannah, they come across as a legitimate medical option. And very similar to our results with the ads, about 27% of these Google reviews that we saw had testimonials stating that as a result of treatment, cancer was cured, in remission, or their lives were meaningfully prolonged. So as takeaways from my presentation, what I want to leave you with is that alternative cancer providers host, they target, and they exploit cancer patients using ads. These bogus ads are really horrible, but they're only a symptom of an overall problem. There exists a conflict of interest between public health and social media platform interests, which I think is being increasingly recognized. And public health has little power to regulate social media, and we're stuck in this loop of appealing to their good nature. We need to re-problematize targeted ads. We have to recognize that these symptoms are harmful before harm occurs, and to achieve this, we need political courage. And really key, look at the system that enables ads and not only the advertiser. It's horrible, some of the messages we saw from the advertisers, but the system that enables that to happen is worse. Thank you very much for your time, and if you ever want to connect, I'd love to talk more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marco, for that talk. I do have maybe one or two questions I'll ask you before we move on to our next speaker. So in your talk, you were mentioning about some of the tactics that these organizations use when they're making these ads for the alternative cancer treatments. I was wondering, what do you think about experts or those of us on the other side of things, trying to use similar strategies to ensure that we are able to actually get the accurate information outside? Because we've seen, at least within the misinformation space, and the bad actors using these strategies are extremely powerful, and they're able to appeal to people's emotions and bring them over. What about us on this side, trying to ensure that we're getting accurate information out there? Are there ways that we can use these strategies to be more effective at combating misinformation?
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. Now, I kind of almost bring it back to what Sandro said earlier about how these interfaces can be used from both sides. What I think is really key in this equation is that a lot of the folks who do cancer communication, they're so skilled at this, and they really care, and they do a good job at providing this accurate information. But where it becomes kind of unequal is kind of this profit incentive that comes into play here, in that a lot of folks do this from the side of their desks. They do it as part of their jobs, but most of the time they have a different position which requires most of their time. But when profit comes in, it's from the alternative cancer providers, sure, but it's also from that system that enables them. So from Meta, for example, or these other platforms, their incentive is to maximize how many ads that they can have, and they kind of let it go. So I think if we frame it as we have to counter, we're actually kind of playing into a losing battle, in that we're both advertising a space or a view in a system that's kind of set up against us, and it's going to kind of probably most profit the actual host of the ads themselves versus alternative cancer providers and science communicators.
Great, thank you so much for that. All right, I will move on now to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Emma Quinn. She's a graduate student at the University of British Columbia, and her talk will be focusing on the results of several qualitative content analyses focused on the types of misinformation that cluster together on various social media platforms. Emma, welcome you to the stage.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to be sharing kind of summaries or some of the findings of a few studies that we've done since the beginning of the pandemic. So as we all know, and we've been chatting a lot about today, there's a lot of misinformation. Through the pandemic, we know misinformation is actually not new to the health sphere, but it's kind of been amplified through the pandemic. A lot of the kind of questions and lack of answers early on in the pandemic left people kind of scrambling for something to hold on to. So the World Health Organization has defined the infodemic as too much information, including false or misleading information in digital and physical environments during the disease outbreak. So where are we looking for information? Are we turning to the news? Are we looking at social media? And what are we finding? Or really, what's finding us? There are some algorithms in place on social media that kind of share like with like. So if people are already viewing misinformation in their daily searches on social media, realistically, they're going to be bombarded with more. So our first study in April of 2020 sought out to start investigating the co-branding or other messaging that was being shared along with misinformation about COVID on social media. So at the time, the hashtag hoax was trending on social media. So our first search, we wanted to find out kind of what other hashtags were being shared at that time. And we came across hashtag plandemic and hashtag government lies. So we collected, for 10 days, the top 10 posts of each of these hashtags that were trending on social media, Instagram specifically, in order to find out kind of what this content was. Was it true? Was it false? Are there other messages being shared? In qualitative analysis, we used content analysis. So we're trying to pull out the themes, keywords in this content, whether or not the information is true. So the most frequent words within these posts under the 3 hashtags are up on the screen. And you might see kind of along where those stars are that there's a lot of conspiracy theories. New World Order, the Earth is flat, space is fake, and probably most of us in the room and online know that these aren't true, and we can't kind of rely on those theories. And unfortunately, seeing that conspiracy theories or these authority questioning beliefs are being tied to other COVID misinformation. So this might be suggesting that a certain vulnerable population who already believes some of these untrue theories are more likely to be exposed to COVID misinformation. So during the time of April 2020, a lot of this was questioning mandates such as quarantines or lockdowns, masking recommendations. This was kind of pre-vaccine mandates, so we weren't seeing a lot of vaccine misinformation, but a lot about masks, a lot about whether the government was making all of this up, whether kind of proving other conspiracy theories that this was government oppression. And in terms of co-branding with COVID, overall, we were seeing kind of general mistrust. This was mistrust in media, governments. And so in that first kind of largest portion here, those are the general mistrust posts, the most dominant themes. And a lot of this had direct co-branding with COVID-19. Next, we were seeing conspiracy theories. There was still a lot of direct COVID-19 co-branding here, although some of it just didn't. It was just spreading conspiracy theories. And then anti-misinformation. And this refers to either true information that was being spread or efforts to kind of myth bust the COVID misinformation. And finally, quarantine posts. This was kind of one of our smaller categories, but given the time and timing of quarantines globally, we were seeing a lot of COVID-19 co-branding. So basically, this is saying co-branding is happening. It's an issue. Misinformation doesn't happen on its own. Some of the common themes coming out here were science denial, so people that already believed in some of the conspiracy theories and wanted to deny things like the fact that the Earth is round, and they were more likely to be saying things about COVID-19 that were untrue. We've known in the past that health misinformation is often spread with other kinds of conspiracy theories. So this might be related to cancer, as we've talked about. It can also be kind of vaccines more broadly. And so to follow up with this study, the next year, we wanted to find out if the fact checker programs on Instagram were working, and what kind of things might have changed in the past year. So you can see my imaginary Instagram posts, and at the bottom we have kind of this flag that you might have seen on some social media posts. This comes up kind of based on fact checking for certain keywords, and this is just providing a link by Meta to World Health Organization links, and if you click on it, it brings up the image that's on the right, and this has a kind of a broad list of information. Early on in the pandemic, you might have seen a lot more posts that were flagged as potentially untrue, potentially false information, and seeking other outlets of true information. But now, in my personal searches, I've seen a lot more of this kind of information. So at the time, of the 300 posts that we collected, we found that only one of them was flagged for misinformation. And as you saw on the previous slide, a lot of them had COVID misinformation. So this is pretty concerning and suggests that fact checker programs are really not doing the job to the extent that they're supposed to be doing. Approximately a third of those posts had been removed from Instagram, and unfortunately we don't have a way of telling whether they were removed because users reported them as untrue or they had been flagged and removed. Not all of these posts were removed on their own. A lot of the accounts were either privatized or fully removed. And this might be kind of the user deciding that the general public wasn't kind of worthy of seeing their misinformation, and they wanted to keep those claims to themselves or their own small misinformation or conspiracy theory community. Of the posts that remained, they were mainly related to government lies, COVID-19, flat earth theories, and anti-vaccination. They also tended to have fewer likes, so this is suggesting that the posts that remained did have lower engagement, and they weren't using a lot of other hashtags. A lot of the posts that were removed had kind of long lists of hashtags that really are used as an opportunity to try and get more views. Next, we started a study looking at vitamin D and COVID-19 information together. So this was conducted on YouTube. Around the time there was a trend on Google for searching COVID-19 and vitamin D in the same search. So we wanted to kind of pull this apart a little bit because we were seeing that there was often a suggestion that vitamin D was a cure for COVID-19 or vitamin D was preventative of getting COVID-19. So we analyzed the top themes that were coming out of these kinds of videos, both for visual and audio content. So as you can see, we had a lot of immunity, vitamin D prevention, or COVID-19 prevention, treatments, and unfortunately this recommendation of unsafe sun exposure. So this would be the suggestion that the general public should be exposing themselves to the sun with no kind of protective measures in the hopes of boosting your vitamin D. And so this is concerning because at the time and currently, there's not sufficient evidence to be suggesting that vitamin D is going to be preventative or a cure for COVID-19. It was also concerning on YouTube because a lot of the people sharing this kind of misinformation were medical professionals. So they kind of imply that they have really credible information that they're going to be sharing. Not all of them were currently employed or acting in a medical role, but they're sharing this misinformation. And this can lead to a lot of concerns with the public and kind of undermining the trust that we might have in medical professionals. Following up to kind of our next moment in our studies was we looked at hashtag #JustSayNo, which many of you are probably familiar with the slogan as a war on drugs campaign slogan, but this was redefining and kind of rebranding the slogan for anti-government sentiments. So we started to look at Instagram and TikTok at the same time in the hopes of capturing a bit of a younger demographic on TikTok. I know there's kind of trends in who's using these platforms and why. And so within the posts of hashtag #JustSayNo, the common theme between the two platforms was free will. So this is the suggestion that masking or quarantine or vaccines are kind of undermining people's rights or their freedoms. And then on Instagram, we were seeing a lot more COVID-19 related content than on TikTok. So we had things like government lies, anti-quarantine or lockdown, side effects of COVID itself, side effects of vaccines, side effects of quarantines, as well as the idea that masks either don't work or they're useful or kind of poking fun at maybe flaws in some of the mandates. Meanwhile, on TikTok, we were seeing still some posts related to substance use, related to the slogan that we know, as well as making fun of rules. So these might be ideas of humor, like saying that masks look like face diapers. It might be statements that, how come you have to mask in this space and not the other, and kind of suggesting that the government or the media are making these things up and we should be laughing about it. We then conducted a study on Instagram looking at hashtag #MasksDon'tWork. And here I have a couple of the things that kind of tended to pop up with these posts. We had ideas of government oppression, the fact that masks were people kind of following along, not objecting to any of these requests by the government. We also had people suggesting not to trust the media, that the media were kind of the voice of the government and trying to get people to follow along blindly. Unfortunately, we do actually still have people that are trying to share true information or myth-busting, and they might be a little frustrated if you go on social media and you have a science background, you know what's true, and you're seeing these posts everywhere saying that you shouldn't be masking or saying that vaccines are fake. It can be really frustrating. So among these posts, obviously a lot of these were just mistrust. Humor, freedom marches or parades, freedom and choice, as well as the anti-masking rhetoric, which was kind of expected within this hashtag of masks don't work. This included medical exemption. This often had to do with kind of children in schools or ignoring data. We also saw child-specific content. So some of this contained the idea that masks were a challenge for children's education, a challenge for children's mental health, or the idea that everyone else should masks, but kids shouldn't in their schools. This came along with some of the misinformation that kids couldn't get COVID or kids couldn't be spreading COVID. We also still had some other content popping up in there, and this is mainly related to opportunistic hashtagging. As you've probably seen on social media, there are often posts with wildly unrelated hashtags. So it might be content that's a selfie, and they weren't wearing a mask, but they still tagged hashtag masks don't work, as well as anti-vaccination rhetoric. So this was popping up more in the study because of the timeline of the pandemic. We saw objections to vaccine passports, statements about side effects, the fact that you have the free will or the right to decline vaccinations, as well as the misinformation that you have natural immunity, or that if you get COVID, you're never going to get it again, and it's just a cold. And as we all know, that's a lot of misinformation. Conspiracy theories were still popping up, although less dominant within this study. The idea is New World Order, or that 5G was causing COVID. So some of the common themes overall that we've kind of collectively found in these 5 studies were that conspiracy theories tend to come along with COVID misinformation. And these ideas of authority questioning or questioning the government, distrust in medical professionals, distrust in the health system, distrust in the government and media. And then again, this idea of people's rights, people's freedoms, their free will, tended to be associated with a lot of this COVID misinformation, suggesting that perhaps the people that are sharing these kinds of thoughts on social media generally have distrust and generally believe in some of these kind of alternative theories. And because social media provides a free and open space for people to be sharing information, it's concerning that there's not a lot of regulation or the suggestion that there are kind of things in place like fact-checking programs, but seeing that they're not actually working that well, or with the new efforts of just providing true links to true information isn't actually suggesting that the content that's there is unfortunately untrue. So this leaves people with a lot of questions. And as we saw early on in the pandemic, people were desperate for information. People wanted something to cling to, wanted answers. And I think this contributed to the spread of misinformation, because if someone found a piece of information, they wanted to kind of take it and run with it. They wanted to tell their friends. They wanted to tell their family. And some of the time, this is done because they want to keep people safe. They don't actually know that it's untrue information. But when we're seeing COVID misinformation co-branded with other theories, it's a bit of a challenge to know if this is actually just misinformation or if this kind of stuff is being spread as disinformation with the intent to harm people or the intent to kind of get rid of people that don't believe in the other conspiracy theories. So I just want to quickly thank the rest of our team that couldn't be here today, that all contributed to a lot of these studies. I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Emma. Just for the sake of time, I'll leave my questions to the very end, and I'll bring up our last speaker, but not least, Christy Newton. So Christy is a graduate student at the University of Regina, and she'll be talking about understanding journalistic norms, outpredates misinformation detection relative to trusting the actions of journalists. Christy, welcome you to the stage.
I'll just check that the audio is good from this height. Good. Okay. Right. The big green one. Yes. All right. All right. So I'm probably preaching to the choir by this point when I say that a lot of the problems we're facing today are exacerbated by fake news. Whether it's talking about climate change or COVID-19 and vaccination, or even politics, we're seeing a lot of fake news around these issues and probably lots of other topics that you can think of. So what I want to understand is what's going on behind the scenes, right? Because yes, we're seeing this, but there are consequences to fake news. It affects how people vote. It affects whether they're going to take a vaccine and so on. So we want to understand it for that reason. So I'm going to look at understanding journalistic norms in this study to see how that relates to discernment. So back in the 70s, way before my birth date, people would watch news together, and back then there was a lot of trust for mass media. About 70% of Americans would say that they trusted the media a fair amount or a great deal to report news fully, accurately, and fairly. However, in 2022, that number dwindled to 34%. And that alone was concerning, but then we're also seeing this great partisan divide where Democrats, about 70% of them report that they trust the media, whereas Republicans, it's only at 14%. So very different ends of the spectrum there. And exposure to fake news has been shown to relate to low trust in media. There's some other perspectives out there. So I'll say what I'm interested in is discernment, right? And if you're seeing fake news, that's going to affect whether or not you believe in it for some people. So there are some other perspectives on what affects discernment, some of which you may be familiar with. You'd expect that the way you think is going to affect whether you're a discerning person. Discerning meaning that you can spot the fake news and you can spot the true news. So if you're deliberating, if you're more reflective or rational in your thinking style, you're expected to be better at detecting fake news, right? Another perspective out there is that your literacy, so what you know, is going to affect your discernment. So digital literacy, being familiar with online content, how the internet works, common terms, and so on, that should affect your discernment in a good way, as well as just general skepticism to what you're seeing online. If you're thinking about it, then you'll be able to spot what's true and what's not true. So I want to kind of tease apart those different perspectives and see which of them is, more influential. I can ask you, does anybody, I'll ask, who's in the trusting area, trusting of journalists? Is that affecting it, or is it what you think and what you know? I'll say trusting. Who thinks that's affecting it? What you think and what you know? Well, okay, a few hands for that, so we'll see. What I want to propose before I get there is that it's not just general knowledge that's important. We want to know more specifically about knowledge that relates to journalism as a profession. Now, that may seem very obvious to you, but research has been done on how Americans interact with journalism, for example, and we saw that they don't understand common terms used by journalists. For example, they don't know what anonymous sourcing is. They think it's just a random source unknown to the journalists themselves that they're not even checking in, they're not fact-checking and so on. So if there are misperceptions about that, what else do people not know about journalism? Do they know that journalists, like any other professionals, whether it's doctors, lawyers, academics, we operate by a code of ethics. And this is going to guide how you behave within your profession, right? If you want to be seen as credible, a good source of information. But if people are not aware of that, perhaps they don't trust the media for that reason. Perhaps that's why they believe in misinformation. So I want to understand the nature of people's skepticism about journalism. Is it related to them trusting the actions of journalists? Or is it because they don't understand how journalism works? And then once I know that, then I want to look at how that relates to discernment. So your ability to decipher between that low quality and high quality content. To do this, I did a sample with 1,061 Americans, and they were recruited on Lucid. So it's an online platform, and it quota matches the participants based on different demographics as they show up in the US population. So 2 studies were done, and I'm going to present them together because the results were very similar. The first thing we looked at was people's knowledge of journalistic norms. So this was taken directly from this code of ethics. There are 45 statements that outline what journalists should be doing. I'll give you an example. So we would ask participants this question. We're interested in what you know about journalism as a profession. What is it that journalists are supposed to do based on journalistic norms and professional standards? So norms is what we use to describe these statements from the Code of Ethics. We'd have this statement, journalists are supposed to, And then we'd insert one of these statements from the norm. On the other hand, we wanted to see what people think journalists are actually doing. And this is their opinions of journalists' actions. Do they actually trust journalists to do what they're supposed to do? We'd ask them this question: we're interested in what you think journalists actually do. Based on your general experience reading news articles, how do you think actual journalists decide what to publish, and so on? We'd ask them the preamble, journalists actually, and then insert one of the norms. Now, we'd have to make sure that they understand which one they're responding to, so we gave them a test to make sure they were following the study. And because the norms, they were positively worded as statements of what you should do, we reverse worded half of them so that they were more negative. So it would say journalists actually do not avoid conflicts of interest instead of journalists actually avoid conflicts of interest. And that was randomized across the participants. So for our outcome, we wanted to look at discernment, right? If we're talking about people believe in fake news, we want to be able to test that within the context of the study. So we looked at some news headlines, specifically political news headlines, and we calculated an accuracy score, which is discernment, by subtracting their ratings of the fake news from their ratings of the true news. So if you believed that fake news was accurate more than you believed that true news was accurate, then you would have a low discernment score. Now the headlines, they were split so that 10 were Republican-leaning and 10 were Democrat-leaning, and half of them were true, half of them were false within those groups. So an example of what the pro-Republican or Republican-leaning headline would look like, it would be something like, Biden's pick of retired general for Pentagon is criticized for breaching civilian control. That would appeal to somebody who's Republican because it's against the Democrat Party, right? And they'd respond on this 4-point scale from not very accurate to very accurate. For a pro-democratic headline, they would look something like this. FBI investigates whether Trump spent $3 million in Wisconsin buying votes. Now, in addition to looking at our norms and actions, we wanted to bring back in some of those other perspectives, right? So I talked about trust declining in mass media and the other perspectives about how you think and what you know. So we want to bring that in here. The first thing that we looked at was cognitive reflection. So are you able to, suppress an intuitive response that comes to mind and think about the more rational answer? An example of this would be if you're running a race and you pass the person in second place, what place are you in? Intuitively, people may think, well, I'm in first place, but that is the incorrect answer. So the test is designed to elicit that intuitive response first. That tends to be incorrect. But if you can stop and think, well, actually, if I pass the person in second, I'm in second, then that would demonstrate that you're more reflective in your thinking style. The other thing that I looked at here was digital media literacy. So this is just measuring your familiarity or your comfort with how the internet works in common web terms. For example, we give them these statements. I often have trouble finding things that I have saved on my computer. Now, if you agree with that statement, that would reflect that you have low digital media literacy. Similarly, we'd ask about these internet-related terms. So how familiar are you with RSS, Wiki, Selfie, and so on? And participants responded on a spectrum. So maybe they have more familiarity with certain terms than others, and then we'd get a composite digital media literacy score. So on to the results. First, I'm going to talk about journalists' actions, and then I'll talk about the norms. So you're going to have the Democrats in blue and the Republicans in red, and we're going to look at what they think about what journalists are actually doing. So do they trust journalists to do what journalists say they're doing or should be doing? Across both studies, we saw that Republicans reported lower trust or less positive opinions of the actions of journalists, meaning that they didn't trust journalists to do those things. For example, they didn't trust that they were avoiding conflicts of interest in their everyday jobs. Whereas Democrats, they had more positive opinions of the actions of journalists. When it comes to their knowledge of journalistic journalism norms, so things about the profession, what journalists should do, there was very similar outcomes here where we didn't see much differences across the groups, but there were variability within the groups. So some people scored lower, they didn't know as much about these norms than others. So what that means is just that Republicans, yes, they trust the actions of journalists less than Democrats. However, there are no differences between their understanding of these journalistic norms. So now that we know that, how does that relate to their discernment between true and false content? First, I will look at journalistic actions predicting headline discernment. We saw a very weak and insignificant correlation here between actions and discernment, and this is a composite, so both Democrats and Republican data here. Now for norms, on the other hand, we saw a good correlation here, positive correlation, meaning that the more knowledgeable you were of these journalistic norms, the better you are at discerning between true and false content. So I'll explain what those R values mean. Basically, they should range from -1 to +1. The closer they are to 0, the weaker that relationship between the two variables. So we're having this at a 0.4, which is almost at that midpoint. So a strong relationship for norms and no relationship for actions, basically. From here, we wanted to do some regressions, which is a bit more of a robust test where we can talk about predictions instead of correlations. What we saw across both studies was that norms was still the significant predictor and actions was not. So what you know was more important than whether or not you trust these journalists. We also saw some other significant predictors here, but of interest was this interaction between republicanism and norms. So before I show you that, I'll talk about the other interesting things. We saw the digital literacy, so it was added in study 2. It did not come out as strongly as norms, meaning that your familiarity with the internet was not as important as your knowledge of these specific norms. And also the way you think, cognitive reflection, being more analytic in your thinking style was not as important for discernment as was these norms. So let's look at this interaction between republicanism and norms. So I split the data, and meaning that I separated Democrats' response from Republicans' response, and I looked at that norms and discernment relationship again. For Democrats, we saw, once again, a positive correlation here between norms and discernment, and for Republicans, we saw that it was the same thing. However, the relationship was slightly weaker than the relationship for Democrats. Meaning that if you're a Republican, then yes, you're going to be more discerning of true news if you're knowledgeable of these norms, but not as discerning as a Democrat would be. So what are the takeaways from this study? Democrats and Republicans, we saw that they could understand, or they had a good understanding of these journalistic norms. However, they differed in what they thought journalists were actually doing. Like that first graph I showed you where there was that decline in trust and very low trust among Republicans, we saw that here where they had more negative opinions of what journalists were actually doing. However, despite their distrust, it did not influence their discernment. What mattered when it came to discernment was how knowledgeable they were of journalism as a profession and what journalists should be doing. In fact, when we talk about these norms, it was a better predictor of discernment than typical correlates or other measures that have been used in these types of studies. So typically we see reflection in these discernment studies, but norms was a better predictor than reflection. It was also more predictive than your education level or your digital literacy, meaning that understanding specifically how journalism works was more important for discerning true and false content versus how you think or what you know generally. So specific knowledge is what they need to have. So some of these problems we're seeing with, fake news and so on, maybe if people understood how journalism worked a bit better, then that would lead them to be more discerning. So thank you for listening. There's no paper on this yet, but if there is one, it will be on Gordon's website. So yeah, I'll take any questions now.
Hello? Is my microphone on? Yes, it is. All right, thank you so much for that, Christy. And I know we have a few minutes left, so I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions to Emma and Christy. So Emma, I'll just remind everyone about the topic of Emma's talk. So Emma was talking on the results of several qualitative content analyses focused on the types of misinformation that cluster together. So she was talking about those hashtags. So hashtag hoax, government lies, and masks don't work. That particular one, masks don't work, can be quite triggering. So I have one for you. So you mentioned the masks don't work can cause a lot of polarization. And actually, just recently, literally a couple hours ago, I was in a Twitter DM chat with Tim Caulfield, and we're talking about this Cochrane review that came out about the effectiveness of masking and the fact that there's a lot of polarization around the topic. How do you think, what do you think are some strategies that we can use to handle conversations around the topic, because it's so polarized, right? And it's even polarized among experts. Some experts are for it, some experts are not. Some of us here are masked, some of us are not. What are some of the strategies you think we can use when we're trying to handle that type of conversation around that polarization?
I think it's quite an emotional topic for a lot of people, and that's part of what makes it extra challenging. If you're pro-masking and you're confronted by someone who's anti-mask, I think it's awkward. I think it's emotional, and trying to respond with evidence and with reason without kind of adding in that emotional component makes it a lot more challenging. And we've seen that. We've probably all felt it. But I think that might be kind of a critical area where being able to just share information, being able to just provide reasons and explanation of those reasons, not just saying, well, there's evidence that says masks work, and having the opposite person saying, well, there's evidence that says masks don't work, and ending the conversation there. I didn't get anyone their answers. I think being able to explain the why and why different research might differ will help answer some of those questions.
Great, thank you for that. And Christy, I'll go to you next. So your research, which you very lovely, you laid it out very lovely. I felt like I was a bit at a scientific talk there. So your research was done with the U.S. population, as I understood it. Can you tell us, is there any information on the Canadian population? What do Canadians feel like, are journalistic norms versus their actions? Is there any information about that?
I think that would be a good next step for the study, just to replicate that in Canada. I will say that we would expect similar things. We've done more recent studies in other domains where we're seeing that knowledge is more important than thinking style, which is just so different than what we would expect. So if that's what the finding is, which it was, then we'd expect the same in Canadians. However, I would expect there to be more positive opinions of journalists. Specifically, I just think Canadians are more trusted in general, but also a lot of the false news that we do see, it's about US politics and not so much about Canadian politics. So I can understand why there'd be more distrust in Americans than in Canadians when it comes to journalism.
Okay, thanks for that. So I'll take this opportunity now to throw it out to the crowd. Does anyone have any questions, both in here and then also online? But I'll give those in the room a moment to go to the mic if you have a question, or feel free to just stay in your spot and raise your hand so I can, so you can get a chance to ask your question. Also, this light is slightly blinding, so I'm gonna try to find you. I think there's a question, yes.
Thanks for the great talk. It was really interesting. I had a question specifically for Professor Zinot. Sorry for the pronunciation. I was wondering if there were any legal aspects this work? Do you have any studies on how it could have a consequence on this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Sorry, would you like to repeat the question so everyone can
yeah.
hear it? Okay.
So if I understood it correctly, is there kind of any legal mechanism to kind of stop the ads that I was presenting? Is that right? Okay. I also want to say I'm not a professor or anything like that. I hope so one day. I think the problem with that is the scale of this is kind of hard, like even for me researching this space, to really consider. So consider like just that 1 week was 310 ads, and I can find that quite a bit to make that study feasible. So technically, a lot of this isn't allowed already in most places. Specifically, in the U.S., we see a lot of FDA kind of like warnings against some of these companies. But some of the issues that we see around this is one, the data is kind of a black box. So we don't actually know a lot of these ads are out there, right, until we look for them. So if we had to do that for kind of all of these misleading claims, if you think just beyond alternative cancer treatment, all kind of like, unmet need and how people use that, the scale gets so big so quickly. So I don't think that, regulatory agencies can keep up with this. And I think this also kind of shows how Meta is positioned as really the only person who can police this, which is problematic in itself. And how I was saying, they're both advertiser and interested party. And when you think that if they take off ads, that can cut into their revenue, that's against their interest. So what's their incentive to do that, right? I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Marco. Anyone else with a question in here? Dennis, any online?
I have a few questions coming from online. So a few people actually have asked the entire panel to comment on the potential contribution of kind of feelings of disempowerment, disillusionment, or doom maybe in promoting disinformation online. So the phenomenon also seems deeply entrenched in kind of an anti-establishment current in an era of individualism and self-promotion where one can find any truth compatible with personal beliefs. How do we address that online?
I think one of the things that was showing some progress is when we had a Twitter establishment who was actually working towards trying to create some kind of measures to combat misinformation. And so we had ideas that were substantiated by evidence of asking people to check if they wanted to retweet, if the information was accurate before retweeting it. That's a lot of research has shown that people would retweet without actually opening the article, so automatically retweeting, and that would also work against some of the bot activity. But of course, we know what has happened with Twitter, and it's changed ownership and a lot of those incentives that maybe they weren't always effective, but we could at least study whether or not they were effective, are now basically not being undertaken. So I think a lot of people are looking for I think people, especially on Twitter, were looking for a new social media site to emerge, and they were hoping that Mastodon would fill that site. And if you watch that curve, it's pretty depressing. A lot of people wanted to leave Twitter and wanted to go somewhere else, but everyone's still on Twitter. So maybe I'm excited for a new social media site to emerge that can start doing things differently or doing things in a different way.
Yeah, I know. I was extremely excited to move somewhere else, but then most of us just stayed on Twitter anyway, so it didn't make a difference. Any other questions, Dennis?
Yeah, there was another question related to ChatGPT, which was mentioned earlier, especially in relation to, especially if BuzzFeed now announced that they will be publishing articles using ChatGPT. What kind of impact could this be on the validity of the information that the general lay audience is exposed to online? A lot of the times, a lot of us are seeing or are exposed to news on our Facebook timeline, for example, for the first time. A lot of people now use that as their first kind of contact with media.
I think that's pretty wild. I think it's, I'm not really sure. I think it's going to be a very wild landscape, to be completely honest. I think the tricky part comes in if we cannot distinguish. So if we cannot distinguish between what's being created by AI and what's being created by humans, I think lots of questions are going to be raised there. And there's already discussions around this, but you'll see some higher level discussions around the ethics that are going to go into program the AI. And these discussions have been going on with, how you get the AI to be more neutral and oversight committees that are going to kind of govern how the AI works, there's going to be heightened discussions around that because you just won't be able to tell. And the repercussions of not being able to tell are huge.
All right, I have one last question here, and I'll field it to Christy before we wrap up. So, of course, the study that you were talking about was related more to adults. So, the younger generation right now, they're getting their news in less traditional formats, not like in the 70s where people were looking more at news and things. So they're getting their information mostly from social media and podcasts, YouTube, etc. Did you account for that difference when you were looking at it in your study? So, for example, generational differences. Those who were looking, the older generations looking at the news versus the younger generations looking at social media for their news.
Okay, great question. I will say we didn't have a specific definition of journalism in the study. We had the statement actual journalist though. So I think it's up to the discretion of the person reading. Who do you think of as an actual journalist, whether they're online, whether it's Twitter or Instagram? Is this person doing these things? So I think that goes into a part of that reflective thinking, how they're thinking about it matters. But yeah, it doesn't matter who's presenting the news. If they're not doing those things, then that should signal that maybe this is actually low quality content and I shouldn't trust what they're saying. I think it would be interesting, though, to do a follow-up study to see how people perceive journalists, whether the younger generation are promoting people who are not necessarily journalists as journalists, and then they look to that as being a source of factual information versus somebody who's been to school for this and knows what to put into their content. But there are other people who are not journalists who do these things. So I think if you're knowledgeable of what should be happening, then you should be okay in whatever domain, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Christy. And thanks to all our panelists today. Can we get a round of applause for them? So thank you, everyone, for your attention and your time. And we just have a couple little thank you gifts. And then with that, I will send you all to lunch break. Thanks, everyone.